Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are diving headfirst into a deeply fascinating university-level exploration of one of the absolute most intellectually demanding subjects in classical theology. We're talking about the biblical text's perspective on human autonomy versus divine sovereignty. Now, if you're anything like most people, especially if you're in your 20s, just really starting to forge your own path in life, you probably feel fiercely independent, right? We all kind of walk around with this profound intuitive feeling that we possess absolute free will, that we are the sole authors of our own destiny. But in this analysis, we are going to put that exact concept of human free will under a microscope. So instead of just relying on our modern cultural assumptions about what it means to be independent, we're going to look strictly at the historical data. We want to see what the ancient texts actually say about the boundaries of human choice. We're going to meticulously unpack how these sources define our limitations and how they view the ultimate overarching authority of God. Sound good? Let's dive right in.
So here is our roadmap for today. We're going to logically dismantle that modern philosophical assumption of absolute free will, and we'll rebuild our understanding using a strict textual framework. We'll start with the omnipotent divine decree, move into a deconstruction of autonomous free will, diagnose the state of total human incapacity, unpack the actual mechanics of how human responsibility coexists with God's sovereignty, and finally, look at the unilateral act of salvation. Let's get started.
Section 1. The Omnipotent Divine Decree, the Sovereign Prerequisite.
To really begin this audit, we absolutely have to establish the very definition of omnipotence as it's laid out in the source texts. According to the book of Job, chapter 42, verse 2, the core premise of God's power is that his purposes simply cannot be thwarted. No plan he makes can be derailed, period. And, we see this exact same foundational truth mirrored in the prophetic books, too. According to the prophet Jeremiah in chapter 32, verse 17, the text states explicitly, "Nothing is too hard for you." By definition, an omnipotent God possesses a will that is supreme, completely unopposed, and final. So let's take a second to think about the logical paradox this creates if we assume humans have total unchecked free will. If human free will means having a completely unconstrained ability to make choices outside of God's control, well, then we have a massive problem on our hands. An entirely independent human will logically introduces a boundary line where divine power is restricted. Think about it like a car with two steering wheels. If you have the absolute power to steer your life completely outside of God's predetermination, then God isn't fully driving the car, is he? But according to Proverbs 19:21, many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. The biblical texts structurally describe human volition as operating entirely within the boundaries established by God's decree. It is never in competition with it.
Moving on to Section 2. Deconstructing Autonomous Free Will, the Myth of Autonomy.
The truly crucial point here is actually found right in the ancient language itself. When we conduct an exhaustive lexical audit of the Greek term aletheia, which is typically translated as freedom, we find something that completely shatters our modern expectations. Today, we tend to think of freedom as, a totally blank menu. You can order whatever you want without any restrictions whatsoever. But according to the biblical authors, this concept of a blank slate simply does not exist. A hard scan of the original ancient Greek texts yields absolutely zero terminology that supports the idea of absolute volitional neutrality. The scriptural framework categorically rejects the idea that your will is just this independent, unattached, floating entity. Instead, freedom is defined strictly within an active master and slave binary. Biblical freedom is not independence from all authority. Rather, it is an emancipation from a specific slavery in order to serve an entirely new master. To understand how jarring but incredibly profound this is, we have to look at how Jesus himself constructed the idea of human agency. According to the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 34, Jesus places human volition squarely within this ancient master-slave paradigm. He states, quite bluntly, that everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. In this ancient framework, a slave's actions are entirely determined by who owns them. Therefore, human volition is entirely subordinate to its inherent nature. The choices an individual executes are exegetically defined not as these totally independent free acts, but as the inevitable organic output of their underlying spiritual condition. The will is never independent. It is always bound. It's bound either to the mastery of sin by natural birth or to righteousness by divine regeneration. But it is a bound will, not a free one. This brings us to Section 3, the state of total incapacity, the core diagnosis. Let's methodically walk through the structural boundaries of the natural human mind to see just how limited the human will actually is. The texts demonstrate a total human inability to self-generate any righteous action. According to the Pauline epistles, specifically Romans chapter 8, verse 7, the unregenerate mind is fundamentally hostile to God. It is not neutral. It is actively resistant, and as the text plainly says, it does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so. Furthermore, we see this massive cognitive barrier. According to 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 14, the natural person is not able to understand the things of the Spirit of God. Why? Because they lack the functional internal antenna to receive that signal. The spiritual receptor mechanism is just simply not there. And finally, we have to look at the actual trajectory of the human heart. According to Romans chapter 3, verse 11, Paul utilizes a universal negation. He states quite plainly, there is no one who seeks God. Left totally to our own devices, humanity possesses zero internal volitional trajectory toward God. This is what theological scholars call the doctrine of total depravity. Now, to really, truly grasp this, we must look at the primary metaphor used in the New Testament to describe our natural state. According to Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, Paul states to his readers, "And you were dead in the trespasses and sins." Listen, this is not a metaphor about being spiritually sick. This isn't about just needing a little bit of help to get over the finish line. This is a deep, structural incapacity. Think about it. A physical corpse possesses zero capacity to respond to stimuli. If you yell at a dead body to get up, it cannot hear you. It cannot reach out for a life preserver. It literally cannot self-resuscitate. The human will in this state is completely devoid of the organic ability to generate a righteous choice. Because a spiritually dead person cannot choose to follow God, the act of being made alive absolutely must be a unilateral act. Someone else, like a divine paramedic, must breathe life into the corpse before it can even open its eyes.
The biblical corpus emphatically affirms that our choices are strictly tied to our underlying nature, and it uses some pretty brilliant laws of nature to illustrate this for us. According to Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7, verse 18, a healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. This uses the fundamental laws of nature to establish a strict, undeniable link between a subject's core roots and its output. A diseased tree doesn't just need to try harder to produce a good apple, right? Its very nature physically prevents it from doing so. We see this exact same concept back in the Old Testament. According to the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 13, verse 23, he asks, "Can the Ethiopian change his skin, or the leopard his spots? Then also you can do good who are accustomed to do evil." The prophetic texts employ these highly relatable, completely unchangeable biological markers to prove a point. An enslaved will cannot unilaterally alter its own moral DNA. Volition is strictly the determinative output of one's core nature. Now, a very common worldly counterargument here is the philosophical idea that ought implies can. The logic goes something like this. Well, if God commands us to do something, we must inherently have the free will and the ability to actually do it. Otherwise, it just wouldn't be fair. But the text actively, explicitly rejects this worldly logic. According to Romans chapter 3, verse 20, the law actually functions as a diagnostic tool. The text says, through the law comes knowledge of sin. Think of the law like an MRI machine. An MRI is incredibly useful. It shows you exactly where your bone is severely broken. But the MRI machine itself has zero power to actually heal your arm. The law exists to expose our volitional bankruptcy. It does not exist to validate our capacity to fix ourselves. Furthermore, according to Matthew chapter 5, verse 48, Jesus commands, "You therefore must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect." This literally impossible command is issued specifically to dismantle the illusion of human capacity. It proves that divine commands are issued against a standard of absolute perfection, totally regardless of our utter inability to perform them.
All right, section 4, the mechanics of compatibilism, coexisting realities. So if humans are so deeply bound by their nature, how on earth can we be held responsible for our actions while God remains completely sovereign? Well, we anchored this section with the incredible and honestly agonizing narrative of Joseph. Joseph was violently betrayed by his own brothers, thrown into a pit and sold into slavery. Yet years later, he speaks this text from Genesis 50:20, which serves as the absolute primary biblical model for compatibilism. Notice the brilliant linguistic breakdown happening here. The ancient Hebrew verb for meant or intended is hashaf. The text uses the exact same verb for both the brothers' wicked responsible action and God's sovereign overarching action. You meant, hashav, evil against me, but God meant, hashav, it for good. This establishes a parallel tracking of intentionality operating simultaneously on two entirely distinct planes of reality. Let's pull these two planes apart for a second, just to understand how they coexist without canceling each other out. According to the book of Genesis, on one level, we have the human secondary cause. Human actors act according to their own voluntary desires, and they bear total moral culpability for those desires. Joseph's brothers weren't robots. They deeply hated him, and they acted on that genuine organic hatred. But concurrently, at the exact same time, we have the divine primary cause. God governs the ultimate outcome to fulfill his sovereign decree. Think of it kind of like an author writing a novel with a terrifying villain. The villain does truly wicked things within the story because the villain's character is genuinely wicked, but the author is writing the entire story to achieve a profoundly good, triumphant ending. A single historical action simultaneously proceeds from genuine human moral agency and absolute divine sovereignty without ever making God the author of evil and without ever clearing man of his guilt. To truly, undeniably reinforce this, we have to look at the ultimate climax of history, the crucifixion of Jesus. We really need to slow down here and recognize the massive tension in this text. According to the book of Acts, chapter 4, verses 27 and 28, the biblical text perfectly combines human culpability with divine predetermination. It notes that Herod, Pilate, the Gentiles, and the people of Israel literally conspired against Jesus. They committed murder. They acted on their own wicked, completely responsible human volition. Yet, the very next verse states an earth-shattering reality. They did what your power and will had decided beforehand should happen. The greatest crime, the most severe injustice in all of human history, perfectly merged fully responsible, wicked human intention with an absolute, predetermined divine decree.
Finally, Section 5, the unilateral act of salvation, monergism.
This brings us to the final resolution of our textual audit today. Based on everything we've just rigorously covered in the previous 4 sections, if the human will is fundamentally bound, if we are spiritually dead, naturally hostile, and totally lacking any capacity to choose God, how is anyone ever saved? We answer that by defining a crucial academic term, monergism. Monergism is the theological framework asserting that God alone acts to accomplish salvation. Because the natural mind is dead and entirely blind to spiritual data, human beings cannot cooperate in their initial spiritual resurrection. Therefore, any movement toward Christ must be preceded by a specific, exclusive, and preemptive action from the Father. It is a one-way street of grace. Let's dive deep into how this actually works mechanically. According to the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verse 44, Jesus establishes absolute human inability through a universal negative. No one can come. Left to our own bound will, it is an impossibility. We literally cannot choose Christ. But look closely at the mechanism of salvation that immediately follows. Unless the Father who sent me draws him. A rigorous textual audit of the ancient Greek word for draws, which is helko, reveals something incredibly fascinating. This is not a polite invitation. It is not an RSVP to a party that you can just turn down if you're busy. This specific word, helko, is used elsewhere in the ancient text to describe dragging a heavy net full of fish to shore or drawing a heavy sword from a sheath. It signifies a compelling, efficacious force initiated entirely by God. It is a rescue mission where God literally pulls the drowning person out of the water, rather than just yelling swimming instructions from the boat. And this brings us to what theologians famously call the unbroken chain, found in Romans chapter 8, verses 29 and 30. According to the Apostle Paul, this sequence outlines an ironclad, completely uninterrupted pipeline from eternity past to future completion. Let's walk through every single link in this chain. Those he foreknew, he predestined. Those he predestined, he called. Those he called, he justified. And those he justified, he glorified. Notice the active subject of every single verb here. God is the sole active subject. There is absolutely no drop-off rate here. It doesn't say he called 1,000 people, but only 500 made it to justification because they used their free will properly. No, everyone who was called is justified. Everyone who is justified is glorified. There is absolutely zero procedural gap in this timeline for human free will to intercept, alter, or decide the outcome. It is sovereignly secured from start to finish. This one-way divine action is explicitly confirmed again in the Gospel of John. According to John chapter 1, verse 13, the text provides a definitive list of elements that explicitly do not cause spiritual rebirth. First, it totally rules out your family tree and biological lineage, not of blood. Second, it rules out human desire and physical instinct, nor of the will of the flesh. And third, most importantly for our audit today, it explicitly rules out human agency entirely. It says, nor of the will of man. The text goes out of its way to firmly establish that human willpower is completely useless as a generative cause of spiritual reborn. Believers are born of God, and God alone. To firmly summarize this unilateral nature of salvation, we honestly only need to look at the biology of birth itself. According to John chapter 3, verse 3, the ancient Greek verb geneo, which means to beget or to bear, is deployed by Christ in the passive voice when he says you must be born again. Think about your physical birth for a second. You did not choose to be born. You didn't decide to start existing. Life was an action performed entirely upon you by your parents. Spiritually, it is the exact same framework. Humans are strictly the recipients of regeneration. We are organically incapable of self-initiating our own spiritual conception. A sovereign, preemptive grant of life from the Father, bringing a dead spirit to life, is the sole mechanism of spiritual life. We don't choose to come alive. God makes us alive.
Which brings us to the end of our forensic audit, leaving us with a highly provocative thought that I want you to just let breathe for a moment. If the historical data is correct, if our deepest choices are genuinely bound by a nature we did not choose, and our ultimate liberation relies entirely on a sovereign unilateral grace we absolutely cannot initiate, how does this absolute divine power reframe your understanding of human gratitude? This theology isn't meant to make us feel like meaningless robots. It's actually meant to shatter our pride. If salvation is entirely a sovereign, completely unmerited act of God pulling us from the depths, it leaves humanity in total awe-inspiring dependence on Him, where literally all we can do is say thank you. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive in this explainer. I really hope this structural breakdown of human agency and divine sovereignty has challenged you, clarified the source texts, and left you eager to explore the incredible depths of this ancient theology even further.